My son sent me $10,000 a month for my care, but for 2 years, my daughter-in-law stole every penny. I was trapped in their house, treated like a confused old woman, while she was secretly spending my $240,000. She would lecture me on being fiscally responsible right after buying a new designer handbag with my money. She thought I was too weak to fight back, but she underestimated me. And I decided her perfect Thanksgiving dinner in front of all her high society friends was the perfect place to serve my revenge. Thanksgiving in my son's home in Greenwich, Connecticut always felt less like a family gathering and more like a theatrical production. And my daughter-in-law Avalon was the director, the producer, and the frantic star of the show. The air was thick with the scent of pine from enormous, professionally arranged floral displays, and something savory from the army of caterers who had taken over the gleaming, magazine-perfect kitchen. I sat on a silk armchair that probably cost more than my first car, feeling like a piece of antique furniture someone had forgotten to put in storage. Avalon, a blur of cashmere and nervous energy, was everywhere. At once, her voice a sharp, bright instrument cutting through the noise. She wasn't just hosting a dinner, she was curating an experience a testament to her flawless taste and our family's success. My son Randall watched her with a look of pure, oblivious adoration. He saw a masterful hostess, a woman who could command an army to produce the perfect holiday. He didn't seem to notice the brittle edge in her voice, or the way her perfectly manicured hands trembled just slightly as she adjusted a silver fork. He'd walk by and squeeze her shoulder, telling her what an amazing job she was doing, how she thought of everything. She would reward him with a tight, brilliant smile that never quite reached her eyes. When I offered to help, maybe peel a potato for old time's sake, she'd wave a dismissive hand, the massive diamond on her finger catching the light. She told me not to worry my head about a thing that they had it all handled, that my only job was to sit here and relax. It was the same tone she used when she'd taken over my finances 2 years ago, a kindness so condescending it felt like a slap. Later, one of their neighbors, a woman dripping in understated jewelry, stopped by with a bottle of wine. Avalon, ever the performer, launched into a monologue about the importance of fiscal responsibility in these uncertain times. She spoke about a wonderfully successful investment she'd made, something about protecting their assets through aggressive but disciplined strategy. She even glanced my way, adding how crucial it was to manage funds for family members who weren't as well sophisticated in the modern market. It was a public justification, a neat little story that explained why a retired nurse with a healthy pension and a dutiful son would need her 40-something daughter-in-law to manage her affairs. The neighbor nodded sagely, and I just sipped my water, feeling the familiar sting of being utterly powerless. The constant performance, the clatter of silverware, and the heavy perfume from the flowers gave me a dull headache. I excused myself, heading to the guest room where I was staying. It was a beautiful, impersonal room, decorated in shades of gray and silver. I opened the drawer of the antique writing desk, looking for some aspirin. My fingers brushed against a stack of papers, tucked beneath a set of folded linen napkins. It was mail, my mail. Avalon must have shoved it in here out of sight. My heart started a slow, heavy drumbeat. Most of it was junk mail catalogs for things I could never afford. But then I saw it. A small envelope with a bright red, angry-looking rectangle in the corner. It was from the assisted living community where my best friend Margaret lived. I tore it open. The words leaped off the page. Final notice. It was for a small supplemental activities fee. A fee I had been told with that same dismissive kindness was being paid automatically every month from the generous funds Randall was sending me. I looked at the amount due. It was barely $100, a rounding error in this house, but it hadn't been paid. for months. A cold, clear understanding washed over me. The money wasn't being carefully invested, it wasn't being protected or managed, it was just gone. And this little piece of paper wasn't a mistake. It was a clue, the first thread I could pull to unravel the whole terrible lie. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep much that night. The shock from finding that letter had hardened into something cold and solid in my chest. The hurt was still there, a deep bruising ache, but it was now packed in ice. For 2 years, I had allowed myself to feel like a burden, a gentle old woman who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention her busy, successful family threw her way. I had accepted Avalon's narrative that the world was too complicated for me now that her handling of my finances was a gift. Lying there in the dark in that perfectly decorated guest room that felt more like a cage, I realized my silence had been mistaken for consent. The woman I was, before I retired the head nurse, who could manage a chaotic emergency room with quiet authority, was still in there, and she was done being quiet. The next morning, I walked down to the breakfast nook with a purpose. Randall was reading the Wall Street Journal on his tablet, and Avalon was directing a housekeeper to polish silverware that was already gleaming. The air was filled with the smell of coffee and a false sense of peace. I didn't say a word. I simply walked over to the table and placed the red-stamped "Final Notice" letter on the polished wood right next to my son's coffee cup. He looked up from his tablet, a small frown of confusion on his face. Before he could even touch it, Avalon was there. She moved so fast, snatching the letter off the table as if it were a spider. Her voice, when it came out, was a full octave higher than usual. But Randall had seen it. I kept my eyes on my son, my voice low and calm. I asked him how this could have happened. I told him I was confused because I thought this was being paid from the account he had so generously set up for me. The panic in Avalon's eyes was like a flash of lightning. For a second, her perfect mask of the competent, in-charge matriarch completely dissolved, and I saw a woman in a terrified freefall. Then the mask was back, but it was cracked. She launched into a breathless, tangled explanation. It was a word salad of financial jargon. She talked about switching to a high-yield account. Something about consolidating assets for better interest yields a minor administrative delay during the transfer, a simple clerical error that was already being rectified. She never stopped for a breath, and her hands fluttered in the air as she spoke. It was the worst lie I had ever heard. Randall, bless his heart, just wanted the conflict to end. He looked from her frantic face to my quiet one and took the path of least resistance. He nodded, telling her it sounded complicated, but he was glad she was on top of it. He accepted the lie. Not because he was stupid, but because it was easier than confronting the alternative. I didn't push. I had my answer. Her panic was a confession. I calmly excused myself from the table, leaving them in the wreckage of their breakfast. Back in the guest room, I closed the door and pulled out my old cell phone. I scrolled through the contacts until I found the name I was looking for, Carol. My friend of 40 years, a woman who retired as a certified public accountant and had a mind like a steel trap. When she answered, I kept my voice simple and steady. I told her I needed a favor, that I needed to know how to see my own bank statements online, the ones my daughter-in-law managed for me. There was a pause on the other end, and then Carol just said, "Of course." She knew, without me having to say another word, that something was terribly wrong. Later that afternoon, Avalon found me reading in my room. She had that bright, false smile plastered on her face again. She told me the little billing issue was all fixed, just a silly mix-up. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that she'd had the landline phone in the guest room disconnected. She explained it was an unnecessary expense in this day and age, a practical cost-saving measure. But we both knew what it really was. It was a warning. My line to the outside world had been cut. The battle had officially begun. The key to winning a war is choosing the right hill to die on, and the breakfast table had not been it. My goal wasn't to win the skirmish. It was to confirm I had an enemy. Now that I knew it was time for a strategic retreat. The next day, I made a point of finding Avalon in the kitchen. I thanked her, my voice soft and tired, for clearing up that whole confusion with the bill. I told her she was right. These things were far too complicated for me, and I was grateful she was so on top of everything. I even thanked her for being so practical about the guest room phone. Her relief was so obvious, it was almost comical. The tension in her shoulders melted away, and she gave me a genuinely condescending smile, patting my hand as if I were a child who had finally learned her lesson. She saw my quietness as defeat, my compliance as the natural end of the conversation. And that's exactly what I wanted her to see. I spent most of that day in my room planning my next steps with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Of course, I had no idea what Avalon was doing at that exact moment, but I can picture it now. The truth, as I would piece it together later, was so much more desperate than I could have imagined. She was sitting alone in her parked luxury SUV in a shopping center parking lot, the picture of suburban success. But inside that leather and wood sanctuary, her world was collapsing. On her phone, she transferred the last of their emergency savings to cover a private school tuition payment that was days overdue. Then she scrolled through her emails until she found the one she had read 100 times. The subject line was, "Final liquidation statement," from a company called the Phoenix Capital Group. It was a sterile formal notice detailing the complete and total loss of a $400,000 investment. The money she had gambled with, their savings, their future, my money was gone forever. And in the silent, climate-controlled bubble of her expensive car Avalon, the woman who had everything finally broke down and wept. That night, long after the house had gone silent, I pulled out my old iPad. Carol had emailed me a simple step-by-step guide. With a trembling finger, I typed in the web address for the bank and followed her instructions. My heart hammered against my ribs as the page loaded. And then there it was. My entire financial life for the past 2 years laid out in neat, damning columns. I saw every single $10,000 deposit from Randall's salary account, a steady, reliable rhythm of a son's love and duty. And right alongside it, I saw the withdrawals. 2 years of transfers made by Avalon. Not to some high-yield investment fund. The money had gone to Neiman Marcus, to the Greenwich Country Club, to a dealership that leased luxury German cars. It wasn't mismanagement. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. She was using my money to plug the holes in her sinking, extravagant life. In the pale blue light of the screen, I quietly connected to their wireless printer and began printing every single statement. Page after page slid out a mountain of evidence growing in the dark. The next evening, Avalon returned from an afternoon out, practically floating on a cloud of renewed confidence. She swept into the living room carrying a brand new designer handbag, the kind that costs more than a mortgage payment. She made a show of placing it on the coffee table, a trophy for all to see. She caught my eye and smiled, remarking to the room at large that sometimes you just have to make an investment in the family's image. And in that moment, watching her flaunt the very money she had stolen from me, my resolve turned from ice to steel. The time for quiet retreat was over. The stack of printed bank statements sat in my bag like a block of ice. It felt heavy, solid, the physical weight of 2 years of lies. I knew I couldn't confront Avalon directly. Her deceptions were too polished, her ability to twist reality too practiced. No, the person who needed to see the truth, the only person whose belief mattered, was my son. I spent the next morning waiting. I watched the clock, a quiet predator, until I saw Avalon float down the grand staircase, dressed for a charity luncheon. She was performing her role as the benevolent lady of the manor off to raise money for a cause while robbing her own family blind. The moment her car pulled out of the long, winding driveway, I walked to Randall's home office. I knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer. He was on a conference call, but he muted it when he saw the look on my face. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, shutting out the rest of the house. In my hand was the thick stack of papers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply walked to his expansive desk and placed the statements directly in front of him. My voice was low and steady when I told him that I needed him to explain this to me. He picked up the first page, a look of mild annoyance on his face, as if I were a confused old woman bothering him with paperwork. Then his eyes scanned the columns. I watched his posture change, the slight slump of his shoulders as he moved to the second page, then the third. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. I could see him doing the math in his head, the bloodless tally of betrayal. He saw his own deposits, the steady $10,000 a month. And then he saw the withdrawals, the endless stream of payments to country clubs and luxury stores and car dealerships he didn't even know his wife used. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying, dawning comprehension. He whispered the number, a question and a statement all at once. $240,000. His breath hitched. It wasn't just the money. It was the source. It was his wife stealing from his mother right under his nose. Just then, the office door opened. Avalon breezed in, flushed with success from her luncheon, a bright, happy sound escaping her lips about how well the silent auction had gone. She stopped dead when she saw the scene before her, me standing like a statue, and her husband pale as a ghost, holding a thick sheaf of papers. She saw the statements in his hand, and the color drained from her face, too. Randall didn't shout. His voice was a low, terrifying growl I had never heard from him before. He held up a single page. She tried to lie, of course. It was her first instinct. She blamed the bank, a computer glitch, my confusion. She tried to laugh it off as a ridiculous misunderstanding. But my son, my conflict-avoidant peace at any price son, was gone. In his place was a man who had been pushed past his limit. He just kept holding up the papers, his hands shaking with rage, asking her to explain. Explain the club membership, explain the car, explain the shopping sprees. And then she broke. It wasn't a crack. It was a complete and total shattering. The lies dissolved into hysterical sobs, and the truth came pouring out in a torrent of shame and terror. She confessed everything. The terrible investment, the Phoenix Capital Group, the loss of all their savings, the fear of being exposed as a failure in their perfect Greenwich world, the frantic, desperate juggling of bills and credit cards, and finally, the theft. The decision to start skimming from my account, just a little at first, then more, then all of it, to keep the whole fragile, glittering facade from collapsing. She wasn't a monster. She was just a woman terrified of not being rich. She collapsed into a chair, her body racked with sobs, the fight completely gone. Randall stood over her, a man looking at the wreckage of his life, his face a mask of agony and disgust. He looked from his weeping wife to me, his quiet, stoic mother, who had brought the storm down upon them. In that moment, The power in the house shifted, moving from the noisy desperation of their wealth to the quiet gravity of my truth. I was no longer the victim. I was the one holding them all accountable. I looked at my shattered son, my voice calm, leaving no room for argument. I told him we would all be at Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow night, and we would resolve this then. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. The 24 hours leading up to Thanksgiving dinner were the longest of my life. The house, usually buzzing with Avalon's frantic energy, was shrouded in a thick, suffocating silence. We were three ghosts haunting a gilded mansion. Randall didn't leave his office. Avalon stayed in their master suite. I remained in my room, the stack of printed statements a cold comfort in my bag. We avoided each other, moving through the halls like strangers, the unspoken truth. A fourth person in the house, a guest who had already arrived and was waiting patiently for the others. When the time came for dinner, the performance began. Two other couples, the Warrens and the Sinclairs, pillars of their Greenwich social circle, arrived oblivious to the fact that they were walking onto a minefield. The dining room was a masterpiece of opulence. A massive, professionally cooked turkey sat on the table, surrounded by a dozen side dishes in gleaming silver servers. Candles flickered, casting a warm, deceptive glow, but the warmth couldn't touch the ice at the center of the table. Randall was a statue carved from misery, his face pale and his eyes hollow. Avalon was even worse. She was a ghost at her own feast, her makeup a perfect mask, hiding the sheer terror underneath. Her smile was a brittle, painted thing that didn't reach her eyes, and her hands trembled as she lifted her wine glass. The guests, bless them, tried to make small talk, but the conversation faltered again and again, dying in the dead air between my son and his wife. We made it through the main course, a painful charade of polite compliments and strained chatter. Then, as the caterers began to clear the plates, I knew it was time. I picked up my water glass and gently tapped it with my knife. The small, clear sound cut through the tension like a gunshot. Everyone fell silent, their faces turning towards me. I saw the flash of fear in Avalon's eyes. I smiled, a sad, gentle expression that I truly felt. I began my toast, my voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. I told them I wanted to propose a toast to family and to the incredible sacrifices we make for one another. I saw Avalon relax slightly, perhaps thinking this was an olive branch, a way to put the horror of yesterday behind us. I let the illusion hang in the air for a moment before continuing. I said I especially wanted to thank Randall and Avalon for their incredible, unwavering generosity. I paused, then letting my gaze drift over the confused faces of the guests before landing softly on my daughter-in-law. I held her terrified eyes with mine. I told her that the $10,000 she and Randall had sent me every single month for the past 2 years had meant more to me than I could ever possibly say. A ripple of confusion went through the guests. They looked at Avalon with newfound respect. I let the silence stretch, pulling it taut until it was ready to snap. Then, with that same gentle, sorrowful voice, I finished. I told her that's why I was hoping she could help me understand the investment strategy a little better. I asked her, my voice full of genuine curiosity, if the country club membership was part of the portfolio. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical thing pressing in on us, sucking the very air from the room. I saw Mrs. Sinclair's hand freeze on its way to her wine glass. I saw Mr. Warren's polite smile dissolve into a slack-jawed stare. Randall closed his eyes, a single silent tear tracing a path down his ashen cheek. And Avalon, she just crumpled. It wasn't a cry of anger or denial. It was a small, wounded animal sound of pure, undiluted pain. Her perfect face, the one she had spent a lifetime crafting, simply fell apart. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, and a single whispered phrase escaped her lips, audible to the entire horrified table. That she was sorry, so scared. Then she pushed her chair back so violently it nearly tipped over. She fled the room, her hand clapped over her mouth, her agonizing sobs echoing down the grand hallway until they were finally cut off by the slamming of a distant door. The truth was out laid bare on the polished mahogany table amongst the ruins of the perfect Thanksgiving dinner. There would be no coming back from this. I sat there in the deafening silence surrounded by the wreckage. My victory didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like ash. It was the bitter, necessary price of justice. The silence that fell over the dining room after Avalon fled was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. The guests, the Warrens and the Sinclairs, didn't know where to look. They mumbled their apologies, their excuses for needing to leave so suddenly clumsy and transparent. Within 10 minutes, they were gone, leaving behind the ruins of a feast and a family. That night, the truth was finally out, and the cost was devastating. In the weeks that followed, the consequences rippled through their perfect world. News travels fast in a place like Greenwich, and social death is a quiet, bloodless affair. There were no dramatic confrontations, just canceled invitations, unanswered calls, and the polite but firm chill of being cast out. I heard from Randall in a series of strained and deeply ashamed phone calls that the house was on the market. They couldn't afford it, not anymore, and even if they could, it was tainted by the memory of that night. He told me they were in intensive marriage counseling, trying to see if there was anything left to salvage from the wreckage. They each chose a different path through the fallout. My son, to his credit, took full and complete responsibility. He hired a lawyer not for a fight, but to draw up a legally binding repayment plan. He was paying me back every single stolen cent with interest. He called me every week, his voice humbled, not asking for forgiveness, but simply trying to do the work of earning back a sliver of my trust. He was a man stripped of his pride and his illusions, and in a strange way, he seemed more himself than he had in years. Avalon, I was told, had retreated deep into a world of shame and depression. The loss of her social standing, the very thing she had sacrificed her integrity to protect, had destroyed her. Her identity had been built on a foundation of appearances, and when that was shattered, she had nothing left to hold her up. There was no anger, no denial, just the quiet, devastating weight of her choices. I almost felt a pang of pity for her, but then I remembered the cold knot of fear in my stomach over those 2 years, and the pity faded. I, on the other hand, was finally free. I was back in my own modest, comfortable apartment, a place where the air wasn't thick with secrets, and the furniture didn't feel like a judgment. The first repayment check from Randall arrived by courier. I took it not to a bank, but to a legitimate financial advisor, a sharp woman Carol had recommended. We sat in her office, and she spoke to me as an equal, a competent adult, capable of making her own decisions. With that first installment, I didn't pay off bills or buy myself anything. I set up a trust for my grandchildren's education. It was an act of legacy, a way of turning the poisoned money into something good, something that would last. I reconnected with Carol, and over coffee, we spread a map of Italy across my small kitchen table and started planning the trip we had been dreaming of since we were young nurses. Months later, the afternoon sun was streaming through my living room window. My suitcase was open on my bed, nearly full. My flight to Rome was the next morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I glanced at the screen. The name Avalon glowed there. I stared at it for a long moment. My heart didn't pound. My hands didn't shake. I felt a flicker of the old sorrow, a sadness for the woman she could have been, for the family we might have been. But it was just a flicker. Then with a calm, steady hand, I pressed the button to decline the call. I turned the ringer off completely and placed the phone face down on the table. I walked back to my suitcase, zipped it shut with a satisfying finality, and looked around my peaceful, quiet apartment. A small smile touched my lips. I picked up my bag and walked out the door into the sunshine and into my new, unburdened life. In the end, Barbara's story teaches a quiet lesson. It shows that true power isn't found in angry confrontations, but in the steady, methodical pursuit of truth. She came to understand that justice doesn't always feel like a triumphant victory. Sometimes it's a sad and necessary act of closing a painful chapter. It's about understanding that desperate people can do terrible things, but that their desperation is not an excuse. The real victory wasn't in the ruin of a dinner party, but in the quiet click of a suitcase, finally free to write her own next page.